She walked into the most dangerous building in Palermo carrying an oversized folder, 2 broken heels, and 6 years of broken confidence. Everyone in that marble lobby looked at Cassia Monroe and saw the same thing: a mistake waiting to happen. They were right about one thing. A mistake did happen, but it wasn't hers. And when a single scattered document exposed a forgery hidden inside Rafael De Luca's empire, the most feared man in Sicily stopped, turned, and looked at the woman everyone had already dismissed. Stay with me until the end, like this video, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Cassia Monroe walked into De Luca International, the weather in Palermo was doing what Palermo weather always did in November: threatening rain without committing to it. Gray clouds sat low over the harbor, heavy and indecisive, and the air smelled like salt and diesel and something faintly burnt that nobody could identify. Cassia stood on the sidewalk outside the headquarters building for longer than she should have. She counted the floors. 12. The glass facade reflected the street back at her like a mirror she hadn't asked to look into, and what she saw made her chest do something uncomfortable. A wide woman in a charcoal blazer that had been dry cleaned one too many times. A folder pressed against her ribs like a shield. Heels that were sensible but not impressive. Hair pulled back so tight it gave her a headache she'd been pretending wasn't there since 7 in the morning. She had 40 minutes before her interview. She spent 3 of them standing on that sidewalk, breathing. The remaining 37 she used inside a bathroom stall on the ground floor, reading her own resume like it belonged to someone else. Which, in a way, it did. The woman described on those pages, the one who'd spent 8 years as a senior financial analyst at Meridian Capital, the one who'd helped the federal oversight team recover $42 million in corporate fraud during the Hartley-Voss investigation. That woman felt like a character from a book Cassia had read a long time ago and only half remembered. She touched the paper with one finger, traced the dates. 8 years of building something, then 1 phone call from a hospital in Memphis, and 6 years of watching it crumble while she sat beside a bed and held her mother's hand. She folded the resume, unfolded it. Her mother had been gone for 14 months. Cassia had run out of reasons not to try again. That was the only reason she was here. The lobby of De Luca International was the kind of space designed to make you feel small. High ceilings in pale stone. A reception desk like an altar, staffed by a young woman with perfect posture and a look that evaluated and dismissed Cassia in under 2 seconds. The floors were white marble with gray veining that probably had a specific architectural name Cassia didn't know. There were no chairs in the waiting area, just a bench near the window that was too low to the ground to be comfortable, which Cassia understood was entirely intentional. This was a space that said, "You're a visitor here, and visitors don't get comfortable." She checked in, gave her name, sat on the bench and balanced her folder on her knees, and tried not to look like she was trying not to sweat. Around her, the building moved. People in expensive clothes crossed the lobby with purpose, speaking in clipped half-sentences into phones or earpieces, never making eye contact with each other or with her. She watched them and tried to read the current of the place, the way she used to read financial documents, looking for the pattern underneath the surface noise. What she found made her stomach tighten. This was not a normal company. She'd known that intellectually before she walked in. Rafael De Luca's name appeared in business publications approximately 4 times a year, always in connection with large-scale development projects, international logistics contracts, and the occasional vague reference to private equity holdings in Southern Europe. It never appeared in connection with anything directly illegal. That was, Cassia knew, a specific kind of skill. What the publications didn't say, what the woman who'd referred Cassia to this position had said quietly over the phone, in the careful way people said things they couldn't take back, was that De Luca International's clean surface covered something considerably more complicated underneath. Not that this changed anything. Cassia needed the work. The 6 weeks of savings she had left in her checking account were not hypothetical. Neither was the past due notice on her apartment. "Ms. Monroe." She looked up. A man in his 40s in a gray suit stood near the elevator bank, not quite looking at her, his eyes somewhere around her left shoulder. He introduced himself as the HR director, Marco Ferretti, and shook her hand with the handshake of someone who considers handshakes a hygiene obligation rather than a greeting. He looked at her folder, at her outfit. His face did something she recognized. The the rapid recalibration of expectations downward. "Follow me," he said, and didn't wait. The elevator was mirrored on 3 sides, and Cassia was trapped with her own reflection for 17 floors. She looked at herself and made herself look away. That was something her mother used to say. "Don't fix what you can't fix in the next 60 seconds, baby." She could not fix anything in 17 floors. So she breathed. In through the nose, slow. Out through the mouth, slower. The executive floor smelled different from the lobby. Quieter. The carpet was charcoal and absorbed sound the way the marble below had amplified it. Ferretti walked 2 paces ahead of her down a hall lined with closed doors, past a bullpen where assistants and junior staff worked at their desks. A few of them looked up as she passed. She felt the looks land, registered them with the practiced reflexes of someone who had been looked at a certain way her whole life. That particular cocktail of surprise and condescension, the quick calculation of what she was doing somewhere she allegedly didn't belong. She kept walking. She kept her spine straight. It cost her. Ferretti knocked once on a heavy door at the end of the hall, opened it without waiting for a response, and stepped back to let Cassia through. The office was the size of a modest apartment. One wall was entirely glass, looking out over the harbor and the city below, and the overcast light came through it flat and gray and somehow still imposing. There were books on shelves, not decorative books, actual books, some of them with cracked spines and paper tabs marking pages. There was a conference table to one side, a desk in the center, and standing beside the window with his back to the room was a man Cassia immediately understood she had fundamentally miscalculated. Raphael DeLuca turned around. She'd seen photographs. She'd done her research, of course she had. She was Cassia Monroe. She researched everything. It was the only way she knew how to manage fear. The photographs had not done him justice, or perhaps they'd done him a different kind of justice. He was tall in a way that registered in the body before the brain. Dark eyes set under a heavy brow, a jaw that looked like it had been used in an argument at some point and won, a white shirt with the cuffs rolled up to the elbow, and the collar open, which seemed to be some kind of deliberate statement about how little he needed to impress her, or anyone. He did not smile. He did not cross the room to shake her hand. He sat down behind his desk, looked at the folder she was carrying, and then looked at her face. And Cassia felt, with a cold specificity, that he was trying to decide something. "Sit," he said. She sat. Ferretti remained standing near the door, slightly behind her, and Cassia had the distinct impression he was there as a witness to something rather than as a participant. "You were at Meridian Capital," Raphael said. "Not a question." 8 years. "And before you left?" "I was senior analyst on the institutional fraud team." She said it evenly. She'd practiced this. "I was part of the team that identified the misappropriation in the Hartley Voss portfolio, $42 million, recovered." He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Not the way people usually looked at her. Not with the rapid judgment, not with the skepticism about her size or her suit or her soft voice. He looked at her the way she looked at numbers, trying to find what was hiding under the surface. "Then you quit," he said. "My mother got sick." "How long?" 6 years. A pause. She heard Ferretti shift his weight behind her. "And now?" Raphael said. "She passed. 14 months ago." She held his gaze. "I need to work." He didn't say "I'm sorry," which she respected more than she expected to. Instead, he picked up a page from his desk and read it in silence for what felt like a very long time, then set it down. "The position is executive assistant. You understand what that means here. Administrative support, schedule management, document preparation, communications oversight," Cassia said. "Yes." "It means," Raphael said, "that you see everything, every contract, every communication, every number, and you say nothing about what you see to anyone outside this office. You understand the difference?" She understood perfectly. "Yes." 9 people have held this position in the last 11 months. She already knew this. She kept her expression steady. "I heard. Do you want to know why they left?" "If you want to tell me." He didn't. He just watched her for another moment, then said, "Start Monday." She was almost at the door when he spoke again. "One more thing." She stopped, turned. "Your suit," he said. His voice was flat, no readable affect. Buy a better one. She stood there for one full second. She felt the sting of it, the quick, hot shame. And then she felt something else come up behind the shame. Something that had been in her a long time and didn't have a clean name. A kind of old, tempered anger that she'd learned to keep very quiet. I'll put it on my calendar, she said, and walked out. She didn't cry in the elevator. She was genuinely proud of that. Monday arrived in 3 days, and Cassia spent them doing two things. Shopping for a blazer she couldn't exactly afford at a consignment shop 2 subway stops from her apartment, and rereading everything publicly available about DeLuca International's corporate structure, filed partnerships, and visible financial records. Old habits. When she was afraid of something, she learned it until the fear had somewhere more specific to live. What she found in those 3 days was a company that looked, on paper, extraordinarily clean. Too clean, maybe, in the way that very carefully swept floors always suggested something had been swept under something. Revenue figures that were consistent but oddly round. Partnerships with logistics firms registered in jurisdictions that weren't illegal to use, but were the kind of jurisdictions people used when they didn't want to be asked questions. Charitable foundations established at intervals that corresponded with news coverage of DeLuca's operations. The PR strategy of someone who understood optics. None of this told her anything concrete. None of it was her business. She was going to be an executive assistant. She was going to schedule meetings and prepare documents and keep her head down and draw a salary and pay her rent. She told herself this several times. She arrived Monday at 8:15, 15 minutes before she was asked to, in the new blazer. The receptionist gave her the same look as before. Someone from facilities showed her to a desk adjacent to Raphael's office. A good desk, actually, solid oak, with a monitor and a phone system with more lines than she'd used in 8 years, and left her with a binder of procedures that was thorough enough to be useful and dense enough to be intimidating. She read the whole thing by 9. Then she started on the stack of pending correspondence that had accumulated during the previous assistant's departure. By 11, she had organized the correspondence chronologically, and by urgency, flagged 3 items that required Raphael's signature before end of day, drafted responses to 4 routine inquiries, and rescheduled a conflict in his afternoon that Ferretti apparently hadn't noticed. She sent the updated calendar to Raphael's phone. 2 minutes later, his office door opened and he leaned against the frame. "The afternoon," he said. "The 11 o'clock meeting with the Torino group was set to overlap with your standing briefing with legal," she said. "I moved the Torino group to 2, cleared it with their assistant." He looked at her for a moment. "Fine," he said, and went back inside. She understood from the way he said it that this was approximately the highest praise she was going to receive from him on a Tuesday in November. The whispers started that afternoon and didn't stop. She could hear them in the specific frequencies that people believed were inaudible. The dropped voice, the angled glance, the laugh that wasn't quite about nothing. In the break room, a woman named Adriana, who worked in client relations, looked at Cassia's lunch container, looked at Cassia, and made a sound in the back of her throat that carried a specific message without needing words. In the hallway near the copy room, 2 junior executives stopped talking when Cassia walked past and resumed when she'd rounded the corner, and she was close enough to hear one of them say, "He must be running out of candidates," before the corner took her out of range. She ate her lunch at her desk. She breathed through it. She had been doing this her whole life, and she was very good at it, and that fact made her feel, at certain moments, both proud and deeply exhausted. It was 3:47 in the afternoon, on her 4th day, when everything changed. Raphael had called her in to collect a set of documents from his desk, a contract bundle that needed to go to the legal department before 5 for review. He was on a phone call, standing at the window the way he always stood when the call was difficult, with one hand braced against the glass. He gestured at the papers without turning around. She picked up the stack and turned toward the door, and the edge of the folder caught the ceramic coffee mug on the edge of his desk, a stupid, ordinary, absolute disaster of a moment. And the mug went over and the coffee went sideways and the papers went everywhere, and the sound it made in that quiet room was, to Cassia's ears, approximately the sound of her career ending. She heard the phone call pause. She heard Raphael say something in Italian into the receiver. Clipped, then nothing. The contracts were on the floor. Coffee had soaked the edge of 2 of them. She crouched immediately, gathering, her face hot, her breath shallow, her hands moving fast because if she moved fast enough, the shame would have less time to attach to anything. Behind her, she heard Raphael end the call. She heard his footsteps. She did not look up. "I'm so sorry," she said. "The folder, the edge caught the... I'm sorry. Just get the papers." She was getting the papers. She was already getting the papers, her hands sorting fast through the scattered stack, checking for damage, and she was almost done, almost through it, when she stopped. She held one document up slightly, and her eyes moved across it twice, very fast, and then a third time, slowly. She crouched there on the marble floor with coffee-stained contracts in both hands, and a sound began behind her sternum that she could only describe later, when she had time to think about it, as the sound of something waking up after a very long sleep. She knew signatures, not in a casual way, in the precise way of someone who had spent years reviewing financial documents, contracts, authorizations, where a mismatched signature was not a curiosity, but a crime. She knew the way a person's hand moved, the specific pressure points, the breaks in letters, the angle of particular strokes that were as individual as a fingerprint and just as difficult to fake without practice. The signature on the document in her hand was practiced. That was exactly what was wrong with it. It had the shape of Raphael De Luca's signature without the speed of it. Too even, too careful, the loops a fraction too round. The terminal stroke pulled left where his consistently went right. She knew what his signature looked like. She had been processing his correspondence for 4 days, and she had, because she was Cassia Monroe and could not help it, paid attention. This was not his signature. She stood up slowly. The room was absolutely quiet except for the distant sound of the city below the glass. Raphael was standing 2 feet behind her, and she turned around and looked at him, and she was aware that what she was about to do was either the most important thing she'd done in 6 years or the last thing she'd do in this building, and she could not be fully certain which. She held the document out toward him. "Mr. De Luca," she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect it to be. "This document was not signed by you." The room stopped. Everything in it stopped. The ambient hum of the city, the distant phones, the whole building seemed to hold still for 1 full second, while Raphael De Luca looked at the paper in her hand and then looked at her face, and something moved in his expression that she couldn't entirely read. Not quite anger, not quite surprise, but something that sat between the two like a closed door. He took the document from her. He crossed to his desk. He opened the left drawer and removed a folder. And from the folder, he extracted a contract she recognized as the partnership renewal he had signed in her presence 2 days ago. He placed the 2 documents side by side. The silence stretched. Then, very quietly, he said a word in Italian that required no translation. He picked up his phone and called someone. 1 word, a name she didn't recognize, and told them in English to come to the office immediately. Then he set the phone down and looked at Cassia, and the look on his face was something she had genuinely never seen directed at her before in a professional setting. He was seeing her, actually seeing her. Not the blazer, not the figure, or the folder, or the nervous energy. Her. "How did you know?" he said. "The terminal stroke," she said. "It goes left. Yours always goes right." He looked at the documents again, then back at her. "My signatures are different every time." "The stroke is still right," she said, "even when everything else varies." The office door opened. A man came in, one of the executives she'd seen in the hallway, mid-40s, expensive suit, a face she would later learn belonged to Dominic Caruso, director of external partnerships. He looked at Cassia on the floor with the coffee-stained papers, and his expression did the thing she was accustomed to, dismissed her in under a second. "Raphael," he said, "what's the—" "Look at these," Raphael said, and placed both documents on the desk between them. Dominic Caruso looked. His face changed in a way that was not subtle to anyone paying attention, and Cassia was always paying attention. It was a very small change, a fraction of a second's hesitation before his expression settled into something meant to look like confusion. But it was enough. It was enough for her. And she saw when she glanced at Raphael, it was enough for him. "I'm not sure what you're—" Dominic started. "Leave," Raphael said. His voice had dropped to something very quiet and very final, and Dominic Caruso left the room with the careful, measured movements of a man who understood exactly what had just happened, and was trying not to let that understanding show in his body. The door closed. Raphael stood at his desk and looked at Cassia Monroe, still holding half a stack of coffee-stained contracts, still standing where she'd stopped, her heels soaking up the spilled coffee from the marble, and said nothing for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then, "Go home. Come back tomorrow." She gathered the remaining papers. At the door she stopped because there was something she needed to know. "Am I fired?" she said. He was already looking at something on his desk. "I said, come back tomorrow, Ms. Monroe." She walked out. She took the elevator down. She walked through the lobby past the receptionist who didn't bother to look up. She walked out through the glass doors into the Palermo afternoon, where the clouds had finally decided to rain, and stood on the sidewalk with coffee on her shoes and a stack of documents under her arm, and the knowledge sitting in her chest like a coal that Dominic Caruso's expression when he'd seen those two signatures side by side had not been the expression of a man encountering a mystery. It had been the expression of a man encountering something he thought he'd buried. And whoever had forged that contract, whoever had gone to the careful, practiced trouble of replicating Rafael De Luca's signature with that kind of precision, they were still inside that building, and they had just learned that she existed. She stood in the rain for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she walked to the bus stop because she needed to think, and she thought better when she was moving. Whatever she had stepped into, it was considerably larger than a spilled cup of coffee, and tomorrow she was going back inside. The rain didn't let up that night. Cassia sat at the small table in her apartment with a cup of tea she'd forgotten to drink and her laptop open to a blank document, and she stared at the cursor blinking on the white screen and thought about Dominic Caruso's face. The way the recognition had moved behind his eyes before he'd had time to stop it. The way he'd left the room. Not rushed, not panicked, but careful. The careful exit of a man who had done something very deliberate and was now calculating the distance between himself and the evidence. She had been in rooms with people doing things like that before. At Meridian Capital, in the early days of the Hartley-Voss investigation, she'd sat across a conference table from a senior portfolio manager who'd moved $11 million through a series of shell accounts over 18 months, and he'd looked at her with that same specific kind of careful when she'd laid the documents out in front of him. The look that said, "I underestimated you, and I need the next 60 seconds to decide what to do about that." She closed the laptop. She drank the cold tea. She went to bed at 11 and lay in the dark and listened to the rain against the window, and did not sleep for a very long time. She was at her desk by 8:15 the next morning. Nobody said anything to her directly, but the atmosphere on the executive floor had changed. Not dramatically, not in any way she could point to and describe with precision, but changed the way a room changes when someone has left it recently, when the air hasn't quite settled back to its usual temperature. People were more deliberate in their movements. Conversation stopped more completely when she walked past instead of tapering down. Ferretti, the HR director, walked by her desk at 8:40 and did not acknowledge her, which was notable because he was a man who acknowledged everyone, even briefly, even dismissively, as a way of reminding himself that he was the kind of person who got acknowledged. She organized Raphael's morning correspondence. She prepared the daily briefing document. She sorted the contract binder that had survived the previous day's incident, the coffee-stained edges now dried to a slight warp she'd tried to flatten overnight with a heavy book. At 9:15, Raphael's office door opened and he came out with his jacket already on and his phone in his hand, and he stopped at her desk without breaking stride, which required a kind of controlled momentum she'd noticed he practiced. "Ferretti's office, 10 o'clock. You're in the meeting." She looked up. "Should I bring the contract?" A pause. Very brief. "No." He kept moving toward the elevator. She watched him go and then turned back to her desk and very carefully wrote 10 o'clock. Ferretti's office on the notepad beside her keyboard, because she was a person who wrote things down, who believed that the physical act of recording something made it real in a way that thought alone did not. Dominic Caruso's name was not mentioned. It didn't need to be. At 9:58, she walked to the conference room adjacent to Ferretti's office and took a seat at the far end of the table, which was where she belonged and where she intended to stay. Present, quiet, observant. Legal was already there, two attorneys from the in-house team whose names she'd learned from the directory. Giulia Marchetti, mid-40s, sharp-edged and thorough, and a younger man named Paolo, who took notes with the focused anxiety of someone who understood that what got written down could also be used against you. Ferretti sat at the near end of the table with a leather portfolio open in front of him and a look on his face that said he found the whole situation personally inconvenient. Raphael came in at 10 exactly and sat without preamble, and the room arranged itself around his presence the way rooms did. "The Verena contract," he said. "Walk me through the authorization chain." Giulia Marchetti opened a folder. The contract was drafted by External Partnerships 3 weeks ago. Standard supplier agreement for the logistics expansion. Routing was through Dominic's office for operational sign-off before it came to you. And the version that came to me appeared to carry your signature, correct? "Appeared," Raphael said. A silence. "The signature is a forgery," Giulia said carefully. "We've compared it with 6 authenticated documents from the past 90 days. The variance is consistent and specific." She glanced at the document on the table in front of her. Whoever did this was skilled, but not skilled enough. Raphael did not look at Cassia, but Ferretti did. A quick, reluctant look that lasted less than a second and told her everything about where his loyalties were not. "Where's Caruso?" Raphael said. "He hasn't come in," Ferretti said. "He called in this morning. Family matter." The word family landed in the room and nobody said anything for a moment. "Pull his access," Raphael said. "Today. All of it. Building, systems, everything." He looked at Giulia. "I want to know every document that came through his office in the last 6 months. Every contract, every payment authorization, every supplier agreement, everything." "That's a significant everything, Giulia." She wrote something. Paolo wrote something longer. Raphael stood. The meeting was apparently over. Everyone else understood this approximately 1 second after Cassia did, who understood it immediately, and there was a brief shuffle of chairs and folders as the room recalibrated. At the door, Raphael paused and looked back. Not at Ferretti, not at the lawyers, at Cassia. "Stay," he said. The room emptied around her. Ferretti lingered half a second longer than everyone else, which told her something, and then he was gone too, and the door closed, and it was just the two of them in a conference room with a long table between them and the sound of rain still hitting the windows outside. Raphael sat down. Not at the head of the table, across from her, which put them at the same level, which she thought was probably deliberate, though she couldn't be entirely sure. He was a man who was deliberate about things he didn't need to be deliberate about, which was itself a kind of information. "Tell me what you saw," he said. "I told you yesterday. The terminal stroke, not the signature, after. When Caruso came in." His dark eyes were steady on her face. "What did you see?" She held his gaze. "He knew," she said. "He recognized what he was looking at before he had time to pretend he didn't. Could be coincidence." "It wasn't." "You're certain?" "Yes." He studied her for a moment the way she imagined he studied a lot of things, without the pretense of being neutral about it, without softening the examination with politeness. It was the kind of look that most people found uncomfortable. Cassia found it, if not comfortable, at least familiar. She'd spent years in rooms where someone was trying to decide whether her assessment was worth anything. "You left Meridian before the Hartley-Voss case was closed," he said. She hadn't expected him to know the timeline that precisely. She kept her face steady. "My mother's diagnosis came in the 3rd week of the investigation. I stayed 6 more weeks, until the core documentation was solid." She paused. "Then I left. The case closed without you." "Yes?" "Do you regret it?" It wasn't really a question. It also wasn't casual. She understood he was testing something specific, and she thought about lying and decided against it because he would know and because she was tired of that particular kind of performance. "Every day," she said, "not leaving before it was finished." She watched his face. "I hate leaving things unfinished." Something shifted in his expression. Barely. "Good," he said, and stood up. And that was apparently the end of the conversation. The rest of the morning passed in a kind of charged quiet. Cassia processed correspondence, updated the calendar, handled 3 phone inquiries from external partners who had apparently not yet heard anything was wrong, which was itself information. Raphael was containing it, keeping it inside the building, not letting the outer shape of the company register any disturbance. She respected the discipline of that even as it added a specific kind of tension to the air, the tension of a surface being held still by effort. By noon, the whispers had started in earnest. She heard Dominic Caruso's name in the hallway twice in 10 minutes, in the particular dropped voice register that meant people were speculating about something they knew was serious. Adriana from Client Relations stopped at the copy machine near Cassia's desk and didn't bother lowering her voice quite enough when she said to someone behind her, "They're saying the new secretary found something. Can you imagine? She's been here 5 days." The disdain in it was specific. It wasn't about Cassia finding something. It was about Cassia specifically, this woman, finding something. The absurdity, from Adriana's perspective, of that particular person being the one. Cassia stapled a set of documents. She did it very deliberately, the stapler making a clean mechanical sound. That afternoon at 2:30, she was in the copy room running a set of contract duplicates when she heard voices in the hallway through the half-open door and stopped moving because one of the voices belonged to a woman she hadn't heard before. Low and controlled and carrying the kind of authority that wasn't performed, that came from years of people listening when you spoke. "She's been here less than a week." A pause. "I don't care what she found." "Victoria." That was Ferretti's voice. "Dominic has been with this company for 9 years, Marco. 9 years." The voice was closer now, just outside. "Whatever happened with that contract, there is a context. There are reasons, and a secretary who's been here 5 days does not have the information to understand what those reasons might be. Raphael has already... I know what Raphael has done. I'm telling you what I think about it." A pause. Footsteps. They moved away down the hall. Cassia stood in the copy room for a moment with the duplicated contracts warm in her hands and a very clear picture of what the next part of this was going to look like. She had a name now for the voice. Victoria Bellini. She'd read the name in the company directory, seen it listed as Executive Director, which was the position just below Raphael's in the operational hierarchy. She had not yet met the woman. She understood, from the 60 seconds she'd just overheard, that this was not going to be the kind of meeting she could prepare for by reading a directory entry. She went back to her desk. She put the contracts in their folder. She did not mention what she'd heard to anyone. At 4 in the afternoon, Raphael's office door opened and he stood in the frame and said, "Cassia," which was the first time he'd used her first name, and she registered this in the part of her mind that registered things without making a scene about it. She went into the office, and he pointed at the chair across from his desk without looking at her, and she sat down. He had a stack of files in front of him. She recognized some of them from the pending correspondence she'd processed that morning. "The Verena contract wasn't the only one," he said. She said nothing. She waited. He opened the top file and turned it so she could read it across the desk. It was a payment authorization. A supplier invoice for freight services, substantial amount, routed through the same external partnerships division that Caruso oversaw. She looked at the signature, then at Raphael's face. 2 months ago, he said. "This one's different," she said. "The authorization. The signature is better. The stroke correction is nearly right." She looked at it again. "But the date format is wrong. You use day, month, year. This is month, day, year." He was very quiet for a moment. "How do you know how I format dates?" "I've processed 3 weeks of your correspondence," she said. "I pay attention." He opened another file. "This one." She looked. A contract amendment. She studied the signature and the document structure for nearly a minute without speaking. Raphael waited. He was, she noticed, good at waiting. Not the impatient waiting of someone managing their own discomfort, but the settled waiting of someone who understood that rushing a good analyst was like rushing a surgery. "This one's real," she said. He took the file back, looked at it himself, and then looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. "Correct," he said. They went through 11 documents in the next hour. She got 10 right. The one she missed was a payment authorization from 4 months back that turned out, when Raphael confirmed it, to also be forged, which meant she'd called it wrong in a direction that was less wrong than the alternative, calling a forgery real rather than calling something real a forgery. But it still sat badly with her, and she said so. I should have caught it. The date format was right because it was close enough to the real format to pass, but the invoice number sequence is wrong. I wasn't looking at the invoice numbers. You weren't hired to look at invoice numbers. I know, she said. I should have anyway. He looked at her for a moment. You've been here 5 days. I know how long I've been here. Something happened at the corner of his mouth that might have been the very early architecture of something that would become a smile if it had more room to develop. It didn't get that room. He closed the last file and set it on the stack and leaned back. Caruso wasn't working alone, he said. It wasn't a question. No. Who else? I don't know yet. The yet hung in the air between them. She hadn't planned to say it that way. She wasn't sure in this moment whether it was accurate, whether she had any standing to say yet, as though she was going to be the one finding out. But she'd said it, and she didn't take it back, because she'd meant it, and because something in the way he was looking at her told her he understood exactly what she'd meant. He nodded once. Go home, he said. Tomorrow we start with the last 6 months. She was almost at the door. Miss Monroe. She stopped. Lock your apartment tonight, he said quietly. Use the deadbolt. She turned around. He was already looking at the files again. She stood there for 1 full second, taking in the weight of what he'd just said, the ordinary words of it, the completely extraordinary implication of it. And then she turned around and walked out. She took the stairs instead of the elevator. All 12 floors. She needed the time to think, and she didn't want to be in a mirrored box. What she thought about on the stairs was the payment authorization from 4 months back, the one she'd missed, because she had been thinking about it since she'd gotten it wrong, picking at it the way you picked at something that didn't sit right. And there was a detail she kept coming back to that she hadn't mentioned to Raphael because she'd wanted to be certain before she said it, and she was not yet certain. The invoice number sequence was wrong, yes, but the supplier name on that authorization, a freight company, Avellino Trasporti, registered out of Naples, had appeared in a different document she'd processed that morning as part of the day's routine correspondence, a mundane thing, a renewal notification. She had filed it automatically without flagging it because there was nothing on its surface to flag, except that Avellino Trasporti, in the 4-month-old forgery, had received a payment of 640,000 euros for freight services that Cassia, who had now spent several days reading DeLuca International's operational structure, was fairly certain didn't correspond to any actual freight route in the company's logistics calendar, and now their name had appeared again, today, on a document that would, by tomorrow morning, be sitting in the pending correspondence she had already organized and set aside. She pushed through the door to the lobby. The rain had finally stopped. The wet pavement outside the glass doors reflected the lobby lights in a way that made the world beyond look like it was underwater. She stood there for a moment. 640,000 euros was a number with implications, not the biggest number she'd seen in her career, far from it. But it was specific enough to be real, and it was attached to a company whose name had now appeared twice in the same week, and that pattern, the reappearance, the quiet persistence of a thread that should have been cut, was the kind of pattern she had spent 8 years of her professional life learning to recognize. Avellino Trasporti was not finished doing business with DeLuca International. Whatever Dominic Caruso had been doing with those forged contracts, the mechanism he'd been using was still running. It had not been shut down when he left. It might not even know yet that he was gone. She walked to the bus stop. She sat down on the bench. Around her, Palermo was doing its evening thing. Foot traffic, motor scooters, the smell of something frying somewhere nearby. Conversations in rapid Italian that she caught fragments of without quite assembling them into meaning. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it for 2 full rings before she answered. Silence on the other end. Then a voice, male, accented, and very controlled. Ms. Monroe. She said nothing. You found something that wasn't yours to find, the voice said. I want you to understand something very clearly. What happened today, what you did today, that was a mistake. A pause. Not the coffee, the other thing. She kept her voice even. I don't know who this is. No, the voice agreed pleasantly. You don't. That's the point. Another pause. Go back to filing papers, Ms. Monroe. Be the secretary they hired. Forget about signatures. Forget about dates. The voice dropped slightly. Forget about Avellino. The call ended. She sat on the bench with her phone in her hand and her heart doing something loud in her chest, and the evening moving around her like nothing had happened, like the world was still the same shape it had been 30 seconds ago. And she breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slower than her heart wanted. They knew about Avellino, which meant they knew she'd seen the documents, which meant they had eyes inside the building. Not just Caruso, someone else, someone still in place, someone who had watched her go through those files this afternoon and made a phone call before she'd even reached the lobby. She looked at her phone, thought about calling Raphael. Put the phone in her bag. She was not going to call Raphael DeLuca from a bus stop to tell him she was frightened. She was not going to do that. She had 6 years of hard-won understanding of her own value, and she was not going to spend it on a panicked phone call that would tell him exactly what everyone in that building already believed about her. That she was in over her head, that she was the secretary who'd gotten lucky, that she would fold the first moment something pushed back. The bus came. She got on it. She sat near the back and looked out the window at the wet streets and thought about the voice on the phone and the specific word it had used. Forget about Avellino. Not don't look into Avellino. Not stay away from the files. Forget. As in, pretend you never saw it. As in, the problem isn't what you know, it's that you might do something with what you know. They weren't sure yet whether she was a threat. They were testing her, seeing if the phone call was enough. If a quiet warning from an unknown number would send her back to her desk with her eyes down and her mouth shut, and her considerable analytical brain pointed at nothing more dangerous than appointment scheduling. She thought about that for the rest of the ride home. She thought about it while she unlocked her apartment door and put on the deadbolt, as Raphael had told her to. She thought about it while she stood in her kitchen under the fluorescent light that had been flickering for 3 weeks and that she'd been meaning to replace. Then she opened her laptop and started a new document. She typed Avellino Trasporti at the top, then the payment amount, then the date from the forged authorization, then the date from the renewal notification she'd filed that morning. She was not forgetting about Avellino. She was starting from the beginning. She was 3 pages into her notes when her email alert pinged. She almost didn't look. It was past 9, she'd been going for hours. Her neck hurt, and her tea was cold again. But she looked because she always looked, because that was who she was. The email was from an internal DeLuca International address she didn't recognize. No name in the sender field, just a string of numbers. The subject line was empty. The body of the email contained one thing, a scanned document. A contract she hadn't seen before. A contract with a date from 8 months ago, with a supplier name she didn't recognize, and a signature at the bottom that was unmistakably Raphael DeLuca's. The real one, the terminal stroke going right. The pressure points correct. The speed of it visible, even in a scan. And below the signature, underlined in red ink by whoever had scanned this, was a clause in the contract's final section, in dense legal language, that she had to read 3 times before she fully understood what it said. What it said was that DeLuca International, under Raphael DeLuca's direct authorization, had agreed to a financial arrangement with a holding company registered in Malta. What it said was that the arrangement involved the regular movement of funds through a series of intermediary accounts. What it said was that the arrangement had been in place for 2 years before the date on this document, making it nearly 3 years old now. What it said, if you knew how to read it, and Cassia Monroe knew exactly how to read it, was that Raphael DeLuca himself might not be what she had spent the last 5 days beginning, very carefully and against her better instincts, to believe he was. She sat very still at her kitchen table. The fluorescent light flickered. She looked at the document on her screen and felt the ground beneath everything she thought she understood. Shift in a way that had no easy name. A slow tectonic movement that changed the whole landscape without making a sound. And she thought, somebody sent this to me on purpose. which meant it was either the truth or it was a very specific kind of lie designed to make her doubt the one person in that building who had given her any reason not to. And she had until morning to figure out which one it was. She didn't sleep, not the restless half-sleep of someone anxious about a meeting, not the shallow drift of someone overtired. She simply did not sleep, not 1 hour of it, because every time she closed her eyes, the document was still there on the inside of her eyelids. The dense legal language, the underlined clause, the signature that was unmistakably real. She lay on her back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and ran the logic of it the way she ran numbers, linearly, without sentiment, following each thread to its end before picking up the next one. Scenario 1. The document was authentic. Rafael De Luca had personally authorized a financial arrangement with a Malta-registered holding company, a structure she recognized as the kind used specifically to move money through jurisdictions with low disclosure requirements. If authentic, it meant the man who'd told her to use the deadbolt, the man who'd spent an hour going through forged contracts with her that afternoon, with the focused patience of someone genuinely trying to find the truth, was himself at the center of something considerably worse than a forged signature. Scenario 2. The document was fabricated. Someone had constructed it, convincingly, at significant effort, and sent it to her from an internal address specifically to make her doubt Raphael before she could become genuinely useful to him, which meant she was being managed, being pointed away from something by being handed something else to look at. Scenario 3, which she kept coming back to and kept setting aside because it was the most complicated and therefore the most likely to be right. Both things were true. The arrangement with the Malta holding company was real, but the underlined clause, the specific section that made it look criminal, had been altered. She'd seen document manipulation sophisticated enough to change individual clauses before. At Meridian Capital, during the Hartley-Voss case, one of the altered contracts had been changed in a single subordinate clause that shifted the entire legal meaning of a 40-page document. You didn't need to forge the whole thing. You only needed to change the right sentence. At 4 a.m, she got up and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop and looked at the document again with the particular quality of attention she reserved for things that were trying to deceive her. She spent 90 minutes on it. She looked at the font kerning. She looked at the margin alignment. She looked at the metadata embedded in the scan, which told her it had been digitized at 11:47 the previous evening, after she'd left the building, which meant someone had scanned it on site and emailed it immediately. She looked at the clause itself, the underlined section, and she read it 7 times in different orders, pulling the structure apart, trying to find the seam. She found it at 5:20 in the morning. The underlined clause was real. The surrounding contract was real. But one sentence, one dependent clause nested inside a paragraph on the 3rd page that modified the entire meaning of the financial arrangement, used a grammatical construction that was slightly off. Not wrong, not obviously wrong, but off in the way of someone who had learned legal English rather than grown up in it. The original sentence, she was nearly certain, had said something different, something more protective, something that established the Malta holding company as a legitimate tax structure for European operations, which was legal and common and completely unremarkable. Someone had changed one sentence that made it look like money laundering instead of legal tax minimization. She sat back. She was nearly certain. Not certain. Nearly was doing a lot of work at 5:20 in the morning on no sleep. She closed the laptop. She looked at the wall of her kitchen. She thought about who had sent the email. They had internal access, an internal address, which meant either they worked there or they had compromised someone who did. They had sent it within hours of her going through the forged contracts with Raphael, which meant the information about what she'd done that afternoon had moved very fast, and they had sent it to her rather than to anyone else, which meant they believed she was a threat specific enough to require a preemptive move, but not yet a threat serious enough to handle in any more direct way. They were still hoping the phone call was enough. The email was a backup. Here, doubt him. Back off. Let this whole thing settle back down. She thought about Raphael's face when he'd looked at the 2 signatures side by side, the specific quality of that silence. She picked up her phone. Set it down. picked it up again. She typed a message to his number, the executive direct line he'd had printed on a card she'd found in the desk drawer on her first day, which she'd memorized automatically because she memorized numbers. And she typed, "I need to speak with you before the building opens. Not at the office. Somewhere else." She looked at it for a moment. Then she sent it. His response came in 4 minutes, which told her he also hadn't slept. An address. 7 o'clock. The cafe was 12 minutes from DeLuca International by foot, which was presumably deliberate, and it was the kind of place that had been there a long time. Worn marble tables, a bar with an espresso machine that sounded like a small industrial event. 2 older men in the corner reading newspapers without appearing to read them. Raphael was already there when she arrived, in the same kind of white shirt and dark jacket he seemed to wear as a uniform, with a coffee in front of him and his phone face down on the table, and he looked at her when she walked in with the particular expression of a man who had already decided several things and was waiting to find out if he'd decided them correctly. She sat down. She took the printed copy of the document. She'd printed it at 2 in the morning because she didn't trust screens for this kind of conversation, and she put it on the table between them without preamble. "This came to my personal email last night," she said. "Internal sender address. No name." He looked at it. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way you looked at something you weren't certain was safe to touch. Then he picked it up and read it. He read slowly, which surprised her. She'd expected him to skim it, to find the relevant part fast, but he read the whole thing, every page, and she waited and drank the espresso the bartender brought without being asked, and felt the caffeine land in her empty stomach like a small controlled explosion. He set it down. "The Malta arrangement," he said. His voice was even, carefully even. "It's real," she said. "The contract is real. The signature is yours." She paused. "But the clause on page 3 has been altered." He looked at her. "1 sentence," she said, "modified to change the character of the arrangement. The original established it as a European tax structure. What's there now reads as fund movement without legitimate commercial purpose." She kept her voice flat and clinical, because that was the register she needed right now, the analyst register, the one that kept everything steady. "Someone changed it and sent it to me. Last night, within hours of us going through the forged contracts." A silence. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that you received a document making me look like a criminal, and instead of taking it to the authorities or simply disappearing, you spent the night verifying it and brought it to me this morning." "Yes." "Why?" It was a real question. She understood that. She answered it the same way. "Because if I'm wrong about the alteration, you need to know someone sent this to me. And if I'm right about the alteration, you need to know someone inside that building is building a case against you." She looked at him steadily. "Either way, you needed to see it." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the cafe window, Palermo was beginning its morning. Motor scooters, the sound of metal shutters rolling up, a woman arguing with someone on a phone. Ordinary life conducting itself at full volume, while the two of them sat in here with something considerably less ordinary between them on the table. "The Malta company is legitimate," he said. "It's been audited twice, clean both times." He picked up the document again and found the page, the clause, and read it again with the focused attention of someone looking for the seam she'd described. "I need my legal team to look at this." "I know." "Not Ferretti." "No," she agreed. "Not Ferretti." He looked up. "You don't trust him." "I noticed how he looked at me in that meeting yesterday. He wasn't surprised that I was there. He was measuring something, calculating." She paused. "He's not your enemy, maybe, but he's someone's friend." Raphael folded the document, put it inside his jacket, looked at her with that same assessing quality she'd been cataloging for 5 days, the look that went under the surface of things to find what was actually there. "Who else knows you have this?" "No one." "The phone call," he said. "Tell me about the phone call." She told him in the text briefly on the way here. She told him the rest now, the voice, the phrasing, the specific word forget, the use of Avellino Trasporti by name. He listened without interrupting, which was itself a thing she'd noticed about him. He was a man who let you finish a sentence. When she was done, he said, "They know you found the Avellino invoices." "Yes." "Which means someone was watching you review the files yesterday, in real time." He looked at the table for a moment. "Not Caruso. He was already gone by the time you reviewed those files." "No," she said. "Not Caruso." His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "I need a list," he said. "Everyone who had visual access to your desk between 2 and 5 yesterday afternoon." She already had it, partially, in her head. She'd been constructing it on the walk here. She told him. 6 people had passed her desk or worked in visible proximity during that window. She named them. His face did something different at the 6th name, a very small movement around the eyes, and she filed that away without commenting on it. He stood, left money on the table without looking at it. "Come in at 9, he said. "Not earlier. I need an hour first." "What are you going to do?" He looked at her. "What I should have done 6 months ago," he said, and walked out. She sat with the remains of her espresso and a feeling in her chest that was not quite reassurance. Something was coming. She could feel it the way you felt weather before it arrived. A pressure change, a quality in the air, the specific stillness before something loud. She was right. She just didn't know yet what direction it was coming from. At 9 o'clock, she walked into DeLuca International, and something was immediately different. The lobby was normal. Same receptionist, same marble, same ambient hum of a large company managing itself. But upstairs, on the executive floor, the temperature had changed. Not the actual temperature, the relational temperature, the way people moved. 2 assistants near the elevator stood very still as she passed, and the stillness was not the stillness of people being polite, but of people who had heard something and were waiting for the next development. She sat at her desk. Her computer was on, which she had not left it. The screen showed her desktop, her files, her email client. Normal. She checked her sent folder, her drafts, her deleted items. She opened the file directory and checked the timestamps on the document she'd reviewed the previous afternoon. Someone had accessed her directory at 8:47 this morning, 17 minutes ago, while she was in the elevator. She closed the directory. She did not change her expression. She opened the morning correspondence and began processing it as though she had not just discovered that someone had been in her files on her own desk while she was in the building's lobby. At 9:30, the shouting started. It came from the direction of the large conference room at the far end of the floor, through 2 closed doors, muffled but unmistakably real. She couldn't make out words, only registers. Raphael's voice, low and controlled, and another voice she recognized after a moment as Victoria Bellini's, not low, not controlled, and underneath both of them a third voice she couldn't immediately place. She kept her eyes on her screen. Around her the floor had gone very quiet, that particular quality of quiet that meant everyone was listening through walls. The shouting stopped. A door opened and closed. Footsteps, fast, moving away. 4 minutes later, Raphael's office door opened and he appeared in the frame and looked at her and said, "Now." She picked up her notepad out of reflex and he shook his head. "Leave it." She left it. The conference room had the atmosphere of a place where something had just happened. 3 chairs were pushed back from the table at angles that spoke of people having stood abruptly. A glass of water had been knocked and was slowly dripping off the edge of the table onto the carpet. Giulia Marchetti was there, standing near the window with her arms crossed, and her face arranged in the expression of someone managing a very large amount of information at once. And across the table, sitting very straight in a chair, was a man Cassia recognized after a moment as Paolo, the note-taking junior attorney from yesterday's meeting. Except he didn't look like a junior attorney at the moment. He looked like someone sitting in the specific quality of stillness that happened when all the options had run out. Raphael stood at the head of the table. He looked at Cassia when she came in, and then he looked at Paolo, and what he said next was 4 words. "Tell her what you told me." Paolo looked at Cassia. He had a face that was probably friendly under normal circumstances, roundish and young, with the kind of eyes that were easily read. Right now they were reading, cornered, exhausted, something close to relief, which was the most frightening expression of all in a situation like this, because relief in a cornered person meant they had decided to stop running. The email, Paolo said. His voice was rough. Last night. I sent it. The room didn't change. Cassia stood very still. From the internal address, he continued, there's a secondary account, not registered to me. I set it up 4 months ago when this started getting complicated. He stopped, swallowed. I thought if you doubted him, you'd stop. You'd back off. Why did you want her to back off? Raphael said. His voice was surgical. Paolo looked at the table. Because I've been doing it, he said. The documents, the authorizations. Not Caruso. Caruso found out. That's why you were going to fire him 8 months ago and didn't. He found out and he used it. He looked up briefly at Raphael. He's been taking a cut for 8 months to stay quiet. The silence in the room had a physical quality. Avellino trasporti, Cassia said quietly. Paolo looked at her with something that might have been surprised that she already had that piece. They don't exist, he said. Not as a freight company, it's a shell. The invoices are fictitious. The payments... He stopped. I need a lawyer. You have a lawyer, Julia said from the window, with a flatness that indicated she did not consider herself to be particularly on his side at this moment. How much? Raphael said. Paolo said a number. Cassia heard it. She kept her face absolutely still and heard it and processed what it meant. Not just the amount, which was significant, but the timeline implied by the amount, the patience and precision of it, small movements sustained over a long period by someone sitting 6 feet from the center of power and trusted enough to have unrestricted document access. The Malta document, she said. The clause. Paolo looked at her again. I needed more time, he said. I thought if you thought he was dirty too, you'd be careful, you'd slow down. You'd take it to someone official instead of to him, and that would take weeks and I could... He stopped. You could finish, she said. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She looked at Raphael. His face was a landscape of contained violence. Not the performative kind she'd seen from men losing arguments, but the real kind. The kind that moved underneath everything and showed only in the stillness of the jaw and the very careful placement of his hands flat on the table, as though he needed the surface to stay where he was. Julia said, I'm calling the full legal team in now. Paolo, you do not say another word without... Wait, Cassia said. Everyone looked at her. She crossed to the table. She looked at Paolo, who was looking back at her with the particular exhausted honesty of someone who had already given up the last thing they'd been protecting. The phone call last night, she said. That wasn't you. It wasn't a question. His face confirmed it before he spoke. No, he said. I don't know who that was. Think. I don't know. I only dealt with Caruso. Caruso was the one who knew other people. I never met anyone else. I didn't want to know. He pressed his lips together. I set up the shell. I processed the invoices. I gave Caruso his percentage. That was the arrangement. But the phone call came from someone who knew Avellino's name within hours of me seeing those documents, Cassia said. You didn't make that call. Caruso is gone. So who? The door opened. Not knocked. Opened. Victoria Bellini walked in. She was in her late 40s, dressed with the kind of precision that communicated authority without announcing it. Dark jacket, dark trousers, hair pulled back in a way that had probably taken no effort, and looked that way deliberately. She took in the room in under 2 seconds with sharp dark eyes, and her gaze moved to Cassia and stayed there. Raphael, she said, without looking at him, I need to speak with you. I'm in the middle of something. I know what you're in the middle of. She looked at Paolo with an expression that was not surprise, then back at Cassia. I know because I've been watching it for 4 months. She took something from the inside pocket of her jacket, a folded document, which she placed on the table between herself and Raphael. I've been building the case since February, quietly, on my own, because I didn't know who to trust inside this building. The room reorganized itself around this statement. Raphael looked at the document. He did not pick it up yet. You knew about Paolo. I suspected. I confirmed 3 weeks ago. Her jaw was tight. I was going to bring it to you last week, then she arrived. Her eyes went back to Cassia. Not with hostility, with something more complicated than that. Something that looked uncomfortably like it might be a form of respect that Victoria Bellini didn't entirely want to feel. And then everything moved very fast. The phone call last night, Cassia said. Someone with access to internal information called her within hours. She looked at Victoria. That was you. Victoria said nothing for a moment. I needed her to slow down, she said finally. She was moving so fast without knowing the full picture, and I was afraid she'd tip Paolo before I had enough to... She stopped, looked at Raphael. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you interfered with my investigation, Raphael said. His voice had gone very quiet. I had been running an investigation of my own for 4 months, Victoria said, with a heat underneath the control. I have been in this company for 9 years. 9 years. And I was 3 weeks from bringing you something solid and complete, and she walks in on day 5 and starts pulling threads without any understanding of what the whole fabric looks like. She found the forgeries, Raphael said. I know she found the forgeries. A pause. I was going to find them too. The room was very quiet. And in the quiet, something began to take shape in Cassia's mind. The document Paolo had built, and the case Victoria had been building separately, and the phone call last night, and the email from an internal address designed to look threatening, but which was, now that she understood who'd sent it, something considerably less aggressive than a threat. It was a panic move. Not from an enemy. From someone who'd been doing careful, deliberate work for months and was terrified that someone else was about to knock it over before it was finished. The case you were building, Cassia said to Victoria. The documents. You have supplier records? Payment trails? Victoria looked at her with that complicated expression again. Yes. Going back how far? 8 months, and I need to see them. You need... Victoria stopped. The air in the room had changed. Something in Cassia's voice had changed, and everyone in the room registered it, including Victoria, who was a person finely tuned to changes in rooms and in voices. Why? Because Paolo processed the invoices and Caruso managed the payout structure, and someone made that phone call and knows Avellino's name and isn't in this room, Cassia said, and her voice was flat and certain in the way it got when the numbers came together. One of those things is not explained by what we know, which means there is a fourth person, and they have been watching all of us, including you, including your 4-month investigation, and they are still out there, and they know this all just broke open. The silence stretched. Victoria looked at Raphael. Raphael looked at Cassia. And then Raphael's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face did something she'd never seen it do in 5 days. A very brief, completely unguarded moment of something that looked almost like fear. He answered it, said nothing, listened. And the color of the conversation could be read entirely in the set of his shoulders, which changed in the first 10 seconds from controlled to something else, something she didn't have a clean word for. And then he ended the call and set the phone on the table and looked at all of them, and what he said was simple and quiet and changed everything. They have my son. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds is a long time when the air has been taken out of a room. Cassia counted them without meaning to, the way she counted everything. 1, the word son still hanging where Raphael had said it. 2, the sound of traffic below the window going about its ordinary life. 3, and then the room broke open. Victoria moved first. She crossed to Raphael in 4 steps and said something in Italian low enough that only he could hear it, and his jaw tightened and he shook his head once. A hard, short movement. Julia had her phone out. Paolo hadn't moved at all. He was still in his chair, and the color had left his face completely, and Cassia understood, looking at him, that whatever he'd expected to happen when this unraveled, it hadn't been this. She looked at Raphael. How old? She said. He looked at her. 11, he said. She breathed through that. In through the nose, slow and deliberate, because the number required breathing through, and there was no time to do anything else with it. 11 years old, and someone had picked him up. From school, from the street, from somewhere ordinary that had been allowed to become a point of vulnerability. as a response to what was happening in this building, as a message, as a mechanism. When? She said. This morning. His voice was controlled with effort she could actually see, the muscle along his jaw, the way his hand had closed around the phone and not opened again. He was supposed to be at school. His driver called 20 minutes ago. The car was stopped on the Via Maqueda. 3 men. They took Luca and left the driver. Left him alive, Cassia said. Yes. That's deliberate. They want you to know immediately. They want the clock running. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not gratitude, not anger, something in between those that recognized she was doing something useful and resented needing it. What do they want? Victoria said. They didn't say, not yet. He looked at his phone. They'll call again. They always call again, Victoria said, and the exhaustion in those 4 words was its own kind of information. Cassia crossed to the table. She picked up Victoria's document, the 4 months of careful work, and opened it and started reading, fast, the way she read everything, pulling the structure out from under the surface detail. Supplier names, payment amounts, dates, the outline of a scheme that was considerably more organized than Paolo's panicked invoicing suggested. There was architecture here. Someone had designed this carefully. Paolo had been a mechanism, a convenient internal operator, not the intelligence behind the structure. The 4th person, she said without looking up. They're not a financial person. What? Victoria said. This scheme. She turned a page. The financial structure is competent, but it's not elegant. It's designed by someone who understands money well enough to move it, but doesn't love it. The operational side, the way Caruso was managed, the way Paolo was kept isolated from the larger picture, the use of the shell company, the phone call last night, and now this. She set the document down. This is a security person, someone who thinks in terms of exposure and containment. The money was a secondary purpose. The primary purpose was leverage. The room was quiet. Leverage over who? Julia said. Cassia looked at Raphael. Over you. He absorbed that without visibly reacting, which was its own kind of reaction. Someone has been building a position inside your company for the better part of a year, she said. Not to steal from you, to own you. The financial fraud was evidence they could use whenever they needed to. And now that the scheme is breaking open, they're not using the evidence. She paused. They're using your son. The word landed in the room the way it had the first time, hard, with weight behind it. Raphael looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Victoria. The list, he said. The 6 people with access to her desk yesterday. Victoria straightened. You said 6. I can eliminate 4 of them immediately. The remaining 2. She stopped. Her eyes moved. Cassia watched her arrive at something and hold it before she said it. Ferretti. Yes, Cassia said quietly. The name had been sitting in the back of her mind since the morning of the meeting, since the way he'd measured her when he thought she wasn't looking, since the too deliberate neutrality of his face whenever Raphael spoke. A person who organized exposure and containment would need to be very close to the center, would need to know everything that moved through the building without appearing to be in any position of operational power, would need to be, in fact, the person who handled personnel and access and the quiet daily logistics of who was where and what they saw. Marco Ferretti, Human Resources Director. The man who had given her the handshake of a man who thought handshakes were a hygiene obligation. The man who had stood in Raphael's office on her first day as a witness to something he'd already decided. Raphael's phone rang. Everyone in the room stopped breathing. He answered it, put it on speaker without being asked, which told her something about his current state. He needed other minds in the room with him, and the fact that he knew that about himself was the most human thing she'd seen from him. The voice that came through was not a voice she recognized. Male. Accented, Sicilian, but educated over, the rough edges smoothed by effort. Calm in the specific way of someone who had decided to be calm and was holding the decision very tightly. You've been busy this morning, Raphael. Where is my son? He's comfortable. He's watching television, actually. He was upset at first, but children are adaptable. A pause. I need you to stop what's happening in that building. Define what's happening. The investigation, the legal team, whatever that woman you hired found in your files last night. A beat. Ms. Monroe is very fast. I wasn't expecting that. Cassia looked at the phone on the table. She made herself breathe normally. What do you want? Raphael said. I want the files that Julia Marchetti has compiled. Every copy, every backup. I want the investigation closed and attributed to an internal accounting error. I want Paolo released without charges, quietly, with a settlement and an NDA. Another pause. And I want Ms. Monroe to resign. Today. Before noon. That's a lot of wants, Raphael said. You have 11-year-old reasons to accommodate them. Cassia looked at Julia. Julia was writing on the pad she'd had open since the beginning of the meeting. Coordinates, Cassia realized, watching her hand, or trying to be, writing down everything in the voice she could identify, every background sound, every characteristic. Doing her job with everything she had, because doing your job was the only thing available when everything else was out of your hands. I need time, Raphael said. You have 3 hours. The voice said it pleasantly. After 3 hours, I make different decisions. Call this number when you're ready. The call ended. Nobody spoke. Then Raphael picked up the phone and threw it. Not in a rage, with a precise controlled movement that was somehow more frightening than rage. A short arm motion and the phone hit the far wall and came apart and the battery skittered across the floor, and that was all. He stood with his hands at his sides and breathed. Raphael, Victoria said. Don't, he said. We have 3. I know how much time we have. He turned around. His face was, Cassia thought, the face of a man who had spent years behind armor and had just watched someone find the gap. I need everyone out of this room except Cassia. Victoria's face changed. Not hurt. She wasn't a person who showed hurt easily, but something adjacent to it, the particular tightening of someone who has been excluded from something they've earned the right to be part of. She held it for 1 second, then she looked at Cassia with that complicated expression again, and then she walked out. Julia followed. Paolo, who had been forgotten about for several minutes, stood uncertainly until Julia took him by the arm on her way past. The door closed. Raphael stood at the window, his back to her. Palermo going about itself below, indifferent and loud. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. All of it. No editing. She had been organizing it while the call was happening, the way she always organized, linearly, sequentially, following the chain. Ferretti knows where Luca is, she said. Or he knows who does. But he's not running this himself. He's not the voice on the phone. The voice had too much control. Ferretti is anxious. He covers it well, but he's been anxious since the morning after I found the forgery. She paused. Someone else is directing this. Someone Ferretti reports to. Someone who knew within hours that the scheme was unraveling and made the decision to take your son as a contingency. A contingency, he said. The word was quiet and terrible. They planned for the possibility that the financial leverage wouldn't be enough. They planned for the possibility that the investigation would go too far before they could stop it. Luca is the backup. She kept her voice clinical because she had to, because the alternative was to feel the weight of what she was saying about an 11-year-old boy watching television somewhere in this city. And if she felt that weight right now, she wouldn't be useful. Which means they've been watching your family's movements for some time. They know Luca's schedule, his driver's route. This wasn't improvised. Raphael turned around. His face was very still. Can you find him? He said. I can try to find Ferretti's connection point. The financial trail doesn't stop at Avellino. There's a disbursement that doesn't appear in Victoria's documents. I saw it in the files last night, a secondary routing through a different structure. If Ferretti is the operational manager, he's being paid from somewhere, and that somewhere connects to the voice on that phone. She stopped. But I need access to things I don't currently have. Name them. Full access to the company's financial system. Everything. Not the HR-filtered version that came with the position. The actual back-end records. Payment history, vendor master files, banking interfaces. She looked at him. And I need someone who can cross-reference Sicilian business registrations. Quickly. He crossed to the door and opened it and said one name into the hallway. Not Ferretti, not Julia, a name she hadn't heard before. And 2 minutes later, a young man appeared, mid-20s, with a laptop under his arm and the look of someone who had been waiting to be called. Raphael gestured at the conference table and looked at Cassia. Enzo handles our network infrastructure. He has root access. Enzo looked at Cassia the way young men in IT departments sometimes looked at women who were about to ask them to do things outside the normal protocol. Skeptical, slightly defensive, not quite rude. Then he looked at Raphael, and what he saw in Raphael's face eliminated the skepticism in approximately 1 second. "Whatever she needs," Raphael said. "Now." Cassia pulled out a chair and sat down, and Enzo opened the laptop, and she said, "Vendor master file, full history, unfiltered, from 3 years ago to today." And he pulled it up and moved the laptop toward her without another word. She started working. This was the thing about fear. Real fear. The kind that had a child's age attached to it. The kind that had a 3-hour clock. It burned away everything that wasn't essential. 6 years of lost confidence, of feeling like the woman who used to be someone, of operating at half speed because she didn't fully trust her own hands anymore. Gone. The noise of the office around her, the sound of Raphael making phone calls in rapid Italian near the window, the distant awareness that somewhere in this building, Marco Ferretti was at his desk, not knowing that the room had collapsed while he sat in it. None of it touched her. She was in the numbers, and the numbers were a language she had never stopped being fluent in, not in 6 years of hospital waiting rooms and prescription pickups and the long, quiet exhaustion of caregiving, not in 14 months of grief, not in 5 days of being the woman everyone was surprised could find her own desk. The vendor master file had 412 active suppliers. She filtered by registration date, isolating entries added in the last 14 months. 47. She filtered by payment volume, pulling the top quarter by total disbursement. 11 suppliers. She ran each name against the visible logistics calendar the way she'd run Avellino, looking for the gap between what the invoice claimed and what the operations could support. 3 of the 11 had that gap. She pulled the payment routing details for all 3. 2 of them routed through European banking networks she recognized as legitimate, with correspondent banks she could verify. The 3rd routed through a structure she'd seen before, not in DeLuca's files, but in her memory, in the taxonomy of financial structures she'd spent 8 years learning. A Maltese holding company with a specific kind of numbered subaccount structure that appeared in exactly one context she was aware of, a pattern documented in the Hartley-Voss investigation's secondary findings. A pattern that connected to a network of Sicilian registered businesses that the investigating team had flagged as potentially linked to organized money movement, but had never fully traced because the trail went into jurisdictions that didn't cooperate. Her hand stopped on the keyboard. She looked at the screen for 3 full seconds. "Enzo," she said, "I need the full registration document for this company." She pointed at the screen. "Government registry, everything public-facing." He typed. It took 90 seconds. He turned the laptop toward her. The company was registered 18 months ago. Director listed as a corporate service provider, standard, anonymous. But the registered address was a building in Palermo's financial district that she knew specifically because she had walked past it twice in the last week. It was the building 2 blocks from DeLuca International that shared a parking structure with the main building. The building where, she had noticed on her second day because she noticed everything, Marco Ferretti's car was parked each morning, not in the DeLuca structure, in the adjacent one. "Raphael," she said. He crossed the room in 4 steps. She showed him the screen. She showed him the address. She watched his face. "He's been meeting them," she said. "Not in this building. Next door. The shared structure gives him a reason to be there. Parking. Nothing unusual. But the registered address for the company that's been receiving these disbursements is the same building." She looked at him. "Which means whoever is holding Luca is someone connected to a physical location 2 blocks from where we're standing." He was already moving toward the door. "Raphael." Her voice was sharp enough to stop him. He turned. "If you go in there right now, they'll know the building is compromised, and they'll move Luca before you have a location." He stared at her. The violence under his stillness was the most present it had been since she'd known him. "So what do you suggest?" he said, and the flatness of it contained worlds. Ferretti doesn't know what we know, she said. He thinks the call this morning bought them 3 hours. He's sitting at his desk right now waiting for the situation to resolve in their favor. She stood. Let me talk to him. No. He's not going to tell you anything. You walk into his office right now, he lawyers up or he bolts, and they move Luca and we lose the thread. She looked at him steadily. But if I walk in, if he thinks I'm frightened, if he thinks I'm the secretary who's in over her head and looking for a way out, he'll say things he wouldn't say to you. A silence. He'll think you sent me as a peace offering, she said, that you're trying to manage me, keep me quiet, feel out what it would take. She kept her voice very even. He underestimates me. Let me use that one more time. Raphael looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully inventory because there were too many things in it and she didn't have time to be careful about reading it. If anything, he started. I'll leave the door open, she said. I'll keep him talking. You'll hear everything. She didn't wait for him to agree. She crossed to the door and opened it and walked out into the hallway where DeLuca International was conducting its ordinary morning. Phones ringing, assistants moving between desks, the ambient mechanical hum of a large organization that didn't yet know the ground had shifted underneath it. She walked the length of the floor to the HR wing. She kept her pace measured. Her blazer was on, her folder was under her arm, the same instinctive armor she'd walked in with on day one. And she breathed through her nose and felt her heartbeat, which was fast but not unmanageable, the rhythm of someone running, not panicking, and she knocked once on Ferretti's office door and opened it without waiting. He was at his desk. He looked up and his face did the calculation, rapid and visible to her even if it wasn't visible to him, assessing what her being here meant, what expression to put on, and landing on something that was meant to look like mild professional surprise. Miss Monroe, he said, I wasn't expecting. I know, she said. She came in and closed the door behind her and sat down in the chair across from his desk without being asked, and the sitting without being asked registered on his face. I need to talk to you. Of course. The voice of a man being careful. Is there a problem? She looked at him. She let herself look at him the way she'd been trained not to look, directly, without softening it, without the reflexive drop of eyes that she'd spent her career fighting and her whole life practicing. She looked at him the way she looked at a document she already knew was lying. I'm scared, she said. His face shifted toward something. Of what? He said carefully. Of what's happening in that building. Of what I found. She put her hands on the desk, both of them flat, which was a gesture of openness that she'd learned a long time ago made people feel like they were receiving a confidence. I didn't know what I was walking into when I took this job. I needed work. I took the first thing that came, and now... She stopped. Let a breath out that was slightly too long, slightly too controlled, but only slightly. I need to know if there's a way to step back from this. Ferretti looked at her. She watched him want to believe her and worked to make sure he was right to want to believe her. He was a careful man. But careful men had the specific vulnerability of wanting to be right about their assessments of people. What do you mean, step back? He said. The investigation, the documents, whatever's happening with legal. She looked at her hands. If I resigned today, if I went to Raphael and said it was all too much, that I made a mistake coming here, that I needed to go, what would happen to what I found? Ferretti was quiet for a moment. She could hear his breathing. That would depend, he said slowly, on what exactly you found and who you'd told about it. I told Raphael about the signatures, she said. Yesterday, just the signatures. And the Malta document. She looked up. She let her face register exactly the right amount of surprise. Not too much, not performed. Just the small human flinch of someone whose card has been turned face up. How did you know about Ms. Monroe? His voice had changed, dropped the professional register, come closer to something real, which was exactly what she'd needed it to do. I've been in this building a long time. I know what moves through it. He looked at her with something that was almost kind, in the specific way of someone who is calculating while performing kindness. If you resign today, take nothing with you, and speak to no one about what you've seen this week. The Malta document, the supplier files, all of it. I think it's entirely possible that you leave here quietly, and this simply becomes a job that didn't work out. And if I don't, she said. He held her gaze. Then the situation becomes considerably more complicated for everyone involved. A pause. Including you. She looked at him for a moment. In the silence, she could hear the building around them, the phones, the distant elevator, the ordinary machinery of a company that was, at this moment, being held together by the fact that most of the people in it didn't know it was coming apart. Ferretti, she said. Her voice was different now, not frightened, not soft. The analyst's voice, flat and precise, and carrying all 8 years of it without apology. I want to ask you something, and I need you to hear it as the question it is, not as a threat. His face changed. The boy, she said quietly. How long have you known about the boy? The silence that followed was 4 seconds long, and in those 4 seconds Marco Ferretti's face traveled through 5 distinct expressions. And the fifth one, the one that settled, the one that stayed, was not the expression of a man who had been caught. It was the expression of a man who had just understood, fully and finally, that he had catastrophically underestimated the woman sitting across from him. He reached for the phone on his desk. The door opened. Rafael De Luca walked in, and behind him 2 men she hadn't seen before with the specific quality of presence that required no introduction. And Ferretti's hand stopped on the phone, and he sat very still, and the room had the absolute concentrated silence of something that had just become irreversible. Cassia stood up, stepped back, gave the room to Rafael, because this part wasn't hers. But as she moved toward the door, Ferretti looked at her, not at Rafael, at her. And what was in his face was something she had seen before in exactly one other context, across exactly one other conference table, from exactly one other man who had spent a long time thinking he was invisible. He said, very quietly, "How?" She looked at him. "The parking structure," she said. "You park in the wrong building every day." She walked out and pulled the door mostly shut behind her and stood in the hallway and put her back against the wall and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. Really breathe. Her eyes closed and her hands pressed flat against the wall behind her because she needed the solidity of something that wasn't moving. Her heart was doing something violent in her chest. Her legs felt like something had been removed from inside them. She was sweating under the blazer in a way she would have been mortified by 20 minutes ago and currently did not have the capacity to care about. From inside Ferretti's office, she could hear Rafael's voice, low and controlled, and with the specific quality it had when the control was doing real work. And she could hear Ferretti's voice responding with the clipped, too careful diction of a man who had decided to negotiate. She straightened. She opened her eyes. At the end of the hallway, Victoria Bellini was standing very still, watching her, and when their eyes met, Victoria held her gaze for a long moment with that expression that was still complicated but had simplified somewhat, had shed some of the layers that had been making it hard to read. And what was underneath those layers was something Cassia recognized. It was the expression of someone who was very good at their work, watching someone else who was very good at theirs. Victoria broke the eye contact first. She turned and walked back toward the conference room, and Cassia pushed herself off the wall and followed, because they had less than 2 hours on the clock, and a child was watching television somewhere in this city, and Marco Ferretti's phone was not going to be their only thread. She sat down at the conference table in front of Enzo's laptop and pulled it toward her and opened a new search window. Because Ferretti was talking in that room, and she had bought them the conversation, but conversations had limits, and she did not intend for the conversation to be the only thing between Luca De Luca and whatever 3 hours looked like when it ran out, and she typed a new search string into the registry database with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, because this was what she was, this was what she had always been, and she was done pretending otherwise. The screen populated with a list of registered business addresses. The third one down stopped her cold. The third address on the registry list was a property management company registered 14 months ago, 1 month before Cassia's mother died, 7 months before she walked into a temp agency in Memphis and asked what was available, 5 months before someone at that agency had passed her name to a contact in Palermo, who'd passed it to another contact, who'd eventually put her resume in front of Marco Ferretti. She looked at the registered director's name. Then she looked at it again. The director was listed as a woman named Elena Caruso, Dominic Caruso's wife. She sat very still for a moment and felt the whole architecture of it shift and resettle into a shape that was uglier and more coherent than anything she'd assembled before. Dominic Caruso had not been a mechanism in someone else's scheme. He had been the scheme's other face, the operational half, the street-level manager, the man who handled Ferretti and handled Paolo and handled the physical movement of money while his wife sat as a named director on the corporate structure that received it. And when Cassia had found the forgery, when Ferretti had called whoever was above him in this chain and reported that the new secretary had found the loose thread, Dominic Caruso had not run because he was frightened of Raphael. He had run because the plan had moved to its contingency phase, because someone had decided the financial leverage was no longer the primary tool, because taking Luca was not an improvised response to crisis. It was the next step in a sequence that had been designed before Cassia ever walked into this building. She stood up so fast the chair rolled back and hit the wall. "Victoria," she said. Victoria looked up from the document she'd been reviewing at the far end of the table. "Elena Caruso," Cassia said. "Where does she live?" Victoria's face changed. "How did you—" "Where?" Victoria was already on her phone, moving, the 4 months of assembled intelligence now being deployed at a speed it hadn't been designed for, and Cassia crossed to the door and pulled it open, and went down the hallway at a pace that was not quite running, because running in a hallway would be visible to everyone, and visible was not what she needed right now. She knocked once on Ferretti's door and opened it. Raphael looked at her. Ferretti was seated, and the two men were still in the room, and the conversation had the quality of something that had moved past negotiation into a harder register. "Elena Caruso," she said. "She's the director of the holding company. The disbursements from Avellino go to a property management firm she's registered under. Dominic didn't run because of the investigation." She held Raphael's gaze. "He's with Luca." The room processed this in approximately 2 seconds. Then Raphael said to the two men something in Italian that moved them toward the door, and he looked at Ferretti with an expression that required no translation, and Ferretti looked at the desk in front of him with the look of a man who understood that whatever calculation he'd been making had just been rendered irrelevant. "The address," Raphael said to Ferretti. Not a question, not a request. Ferretti looked up. He looked at Raphael, and then he looked, briefly, at Cassia. And what moved across his face in that moment was something she hadn't expected. Not defiance, not the last performance of a man protecting his position. It was something closer to a very tired, very damaged version of relief. The same relief she'd seen on Paolo's face when he decided to stop running, and she understood, looking at it, that Ferretti had been in this arrangement long enough that the weight of it had become its own kind of prison. He said an address. Raphael was already moving. She followed him into the hallway, and he turned and looked at her with a sharpness that she met straight on. "You're staying here," he said. "The address is a residential property. If Dominic sees your men coming, the situation changes very fast." She kept her voice flat. "I'm not tactical. I know that. But I found the address and I know what the financial structure looks like, which means I know roughly what Dominic's operational posture is and what he'll do when he's cornered." She paused. "I can be useful." Cassia. The first name again, and something in the way he said it this time was different from the way he'd said it in Ferretti's office earlier. There was a weight in it. "I am not taking you into a situation where someone might—" "You're not taking me anywhere," she said quietly. "I'm going. You can include me or you can waste time arguing about it." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. She didn't move. She didn't soften it or qualify it or apologize for it with her eyes, the way she'd been apologizing for herself with her eyes in rooms like this for most of her adult life. He turned and walked toward the elevator and didn't tell her to stay behind, which was, she understood, the closest thing to permission she was going to get. The drive took 11 minutes. Raphael was in the front seat on his phone for most of it, coordinating in Italian she couldn't fully follow, and she sat in the back with Victoria, who had insisted on coming with the specific authority of a woman who understood that insisting was sometimes more efficient than explaining, and neither of them spoke. Outside, Palermo moved past the windows in its afternoon configuration. School children, delivery vehicles, the golden November light that came through the clouds when they finally broke. It was the kind of light that looked like it belonged in a different story. The property was a residential building in a quieter district northeast of the center. 4 floors, pale yellow stucco with green shutters. The kind of building that had been there long enough to look like part of the neighborhood rather than an imposition on it. There was a cafe across the street and a pharmacy 2 doors down, and a woman hanging laundry from a second-floor window who did not look up as their car stopped half a block away. Raphael's men, 4 of them, in 2 vehicles, were already positioned. Cassia watched the communication happen without words, in the precise economy of people who had done this kind of coordination before. She registered this and filed it in the part of her mind that processed what kind of man Raphael De Luca actually was, the part that had been updating its assessment continuously for 6 days. 3rd floor, Raphael said quietly, looking at something on his phone. Ferretti confirmed the specific unit. His wife uses it as an office address, but it's a residential space. He's used it before as a meeting point. Dominic won't hurt Luca, Victoria said, not loudly. He's not that. You don't know what he is now, Raphael said. I know what he was. A pause. 9 years. Her voice carried something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger, the compound emotion of someone who'd trusted proximity for too long and was paying for that trust in real time. They waited. 12 minutes, which felt like something measured in a different unit. Cassia sat with her hands in her lap and breathed and thought about the document on the kitchen table of a holding company director and the way the whole thing had been built, patiently, quietly, by people who understood that the best place to hide a mechanism was inside the ordinary machinery of a functioning organization, where it would be processed and filed and not questioned because it looked like everything around it. She thought about her mother, which she hadn't expected to do right now. She thought about the 6 years of ordinary days in Memphis, the medical appointments and the pharmacy runs, and the way her mother had sometimes looked at her across the dinner table with an expression that said everything about what it cost a woman to watch her daughter sacrifice the architecture of her life. But also something else, something harder and quieter, which was pride. The particular pride of a woman who knew exactly what her daughter was capable of and was watching her choose love over ambition and understanding that the choice, while real, was not the full measure of the person making it. You'll go back, her mother had said, in the last coherent weeks. When this is over, baby, you'll go back. You'll find somewhere that deserves you. She hadn't believed it then. She was 6 days into beginning to believe it now, and the timing was, she thought, its own kind of answer to a question she'd been carrying for 14 months. The radio in the front seat spoke, 3 words in Italian. Raphael's hand went to the door handle. It happened fast, the way these things always happened. Fast, and then suddenly very slow. They were up the stairs before she'd fully processed moving, and the hallway of the 3rd floor was narrow and smelled like old wood and something cooking on a lower floor. And at the end of the hallway was a door, and Raphael's men were positioned on either side of it, with a physical precision that she found both reassuring and deeply clarifying about the nature of the organization she had been employed by for 6 days. Raphael knocked 3 times. Then, Dominic. Silence. 10 seconds of it, which was 10 seconds in which a great many things could happen, and Cassia stood 4 feet back with Victoria beside her and kept her eyes on the door and her breathing slow and her hands still. Dominic. Raphael's voice had lost the control. Not all of it, but the edges of it were different now, and in the difference was everything. A father's voice, specific and raw and not performing anything. Open the door. The lock turned. The door opened 8 inches, and Dominic Caruso looked out through the gap, with a face that had aged considerably since the morning 3 days ago, when she'd seen it in Raphael's office, registering the 2 signatures on the desk. He hadn't shaved. His jacket was gone, and his shirt was wrinkled, and his eyes moved from Raphael to the men in the hallway to Cassia, and when they reached Cassia, they stopped for a moment with a look she recognized as the same look Ferretti had given her. The recalibration, the arriving too late at the correct assessment. He's fine, Dominic said. His voice was rough. He's inside. He's watching something. He thinks it's his dad's apartment. Raphael said nothing. I want you to know, Dominic said, and his voice cracked on the word no in a way that was not performed. I want you to know I would not have I never agreed to this part. The money, yes, yes, but not this. Not Luca. When they said, when Elena told me what the next step was, he stopped. His jaw was working. I said no. I said I wouldn't. And then it happened anyway, and I couldn't undo it. I couldn't walk away, and I couldn't move, Raphael said. Dominic moved. Raphael went through the door, and Cassia heard, from somewhere inside the apartment, a child's voice say, Papa? High and surprised and carrying in it all 11 years of a boy who hadn't understood what was happening to him, who had been told something reassuring enough to keep him calm for a few hours, who had been waiting in the particular patient way of children who trust that the adults in their lives will eventually explain things. She stood in the hallway and did not go inside because this was not her room and not her moment, and she understood completely and without any difficulty the boundary between the thing she was good at and the thing that belonged entirely to someone else. Victoria stood beside her and also did not go inside. They stood in the narrow hallway that smelled like old wood and listened to the sound of the child's voice saying Papa and Raphael's voice responding, too low to make out the words, and the weight of it was something they absorbed without looking at each other. Dominic was in the hallway with his back against the wall and his hands loose at his sides, and one of Raphael's men was beside him, and he looked at Cassia after a moment with an expression that was past calculation, past performance, past anything except the hollowed-out honesty of a man who understood exactly what he'd participated in and what it had cost. You found us, he said. Yes. How? Elena's name on the registry, she said. The holding company. He closed his eyes, opened them. She insisted on using her name. I told her 100 times. He shook his head, the gesture of a man who had been losing arguments for a long time. The voice on the phone, the man who called Raphael this morning. That wasn't me and it wasn't Elena. I know, she said. He looked at her. There's a fourth person, she said, above Elena, above Ferretti. Someone who designed the leverage structure and made the call about Luca. She held his gaze. I need that name, Dominic. He looked at the wall across from him. He was quiet for a long time, the specific quiet of someone weighing the last thing they have to offer against what it will cost them to offer it. His name is Aldo Sette, he said. He has offices in Catania. He runs legitimate shipping on the surface. He's been trying to get a position inside DeLuca's logistics contracts for 3 years. Raphael kept refusing. Aldo doesn't accept refusals. He stopped. He came to me 2 years ago. He knew about a problem I had, a debt, a personal thing. His face tightened. He gave me a way out of the debt. All I had to do was build him a position from inside. And instead you built him leverage, she said. I built what he asked for. His voice was flat with self-knowledge. I told myself it was temporary, that there would be a point where it stopped. He laughed, briefly and without humor. There's never a point where it stops. She looked at him. The hallway was quiet now. From inside the apartment she could still hear Raphael's voice, steadier now, and the child's voice, and the small ordinary sounds of two people being in a room together in the specific, uncomplicated way of a parent and a child who have found each other after something frightening. You'll give that name to the authorities, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said, like something leaving him, like a thing put down after too long. She nodded. She turned and walked to the window at the end of the hallway, a narrow window that looked out over a small courtyard where someone had planted tomatoes in containers that had mostly given up for the season, and stood there for a moment and breathed, just breathed, the way she'd been breathing her way through things for 6 days and 6 years before that, in through the nose, out through the mouth, slower than her body wanted. Aldo Sette was arrested in Catania 36 hours later. Elena Caruso surrendered to police the evening of the same day Luca came home. Dominic Caruso's cooperation became, as these things sometimes became when the alternative was worse, the thread that unraveled the rest of it, a network of coercive arrangements across 3 Sicilian businesses, 2 of which had nothing to do with DeLuca International and everything to do with a man who had spent a decade building leverage as a primary business model. Paolo accepted a negotiated arrangement that involved cooperation, financial restitution, and the specific indignity of watching a career dissolve in slow motion. But he kept his freedom, which was more than the mathematics of what he'd done suggested he deserved. Marco Ferretti resigned before he could be formally removed, and the letter he left on his desk was, by all accounts, unremarkable. The language of a man managing his exit, saying as little as possible about what he was exiting from. Cassia was not present for most of this. She was at her desk, processing it in the way she processed things, through documents, through records, through the careful reconstruction of a paper trail that would need to be legible to prosecutors and auditors and external oversight bodies for a long time after the human drama of it was finished. She worked 12-hour days for 2 weeks. She ate at her desk more often than not. She took calls from Giulia Marchetti at 7 in the morning and returned emails from the external audit team at 11 at night, and she did not complain about any of this because the work was real and necessary, and she was, as she had always been when given actual work to do, very good at it. Victoria came to her desk on the 4th day. She stood across from Cassia without sitting down, which was a choice that meant this would be brief, and she looked at Cassia with the expression that had started complicated and had been simplifying steadily since the hallway outside Ferretti's office, and she said, "I owe you an apology." Cassia looked up. "The phone call," Victoria said. "I was trying to protect something I'd built. I told myself I was protecting the investigation, but I was protecting my position in it." She paused. "That was wrong, and it put you in danger." Cassia looked at her for a moment. Victoria Bellini was a woman who did not apologize easily. That was visible in the quality of the silence before she'd spoken, the cost of it in her posture. Cassia respected that. She respected things that cost something. "You had 4 months of work," Cassia said, "and I walked in on day 5 pulling threads without context. I understand why you made the call." "Understanding it and accepting the apology are different things," Victoria said. "Yes," Cassia said. "They are." She held the older woman's gaze. Apology accepted. Something shifted in Victoria's face. Not dramatically. She wasn't a dramatic woman, but a small release of something that had been held tightly since that hallway, since that moment when they'd stood side by side outside a door and listened to a child say his father's name. "You're good at this," Victoria said, and the way she said it was not a compliment in the ordinary sense. It was an acknowledgement between two people who understood what this meant, the full cost of it, the specific exhaustion of seeing clearly in rooms designed to obscure, of being the person who notices the thing everyone else processes as background noise. "I know," Cassia said, which was the most honest answer she had. Victoria almost smiled. It was the most human she'd looked in 6 days. She turned and walked back toward her office, and Cassia watched her go and thought that in a different configuration of events, in a room where neither of them had needed to be the first person to prove herself, they might have been allies from the beginning. She filed that thought for later, in the place where she filed things that were true but weren't useful yet. Raphael came to her desk 3 weeks after the day in the hallway. Not to the conference room, not to his office, not in the formal register of the workplace they'd been operating in since the building had been put back together. He came to her desk at 7:15 in the evening when most of the floor had emptied and sat down in the chair across from her that visitors used, which nobody did without being asked. And she looked up and looked at him sitting in the visitor's chair with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up and the particular quality of tiredness that had been in him since the day they'd found Luca. The tiredness that wasn't exhaustion, but was something more structural, the settling of a man who had been running on emergency reserves for 3 weeks, and was now arriving at the terrain on the other side of it. "Luca is okay," he said, not as an update, as something he needed to say out loud. "I know," she said. "I'm glad. He keeps asking about you." He paused at her expression. "I told him you were the one who figured out where he was. He's 11. He thinks you're—" A brief pause. He used the word superhero. I tried to explain that it was more technical than that. She looked at the desk. Something happened in her chest that was warm and complicated, and she let it be both things. "Tell him I'm just a person who pays attention," she said. "I'll tell him that." He was quiet for a moment. The building made its end-of-day sounds around them. The distant elevator, the HVAC settling into the quieter mode it ran in after hours. There's something I need to tell you. She looked up. When you came to work here, he said, Ferretti handled the hiring. I didn't see your full file until after you found the forgery. He looked at his hands, then back at her. He flagged your application when it came in. He almost didn't pass it to me. She held very still. He thought you were overqualified, Raphael said. He told me later, in the debrief, he told me he almost filtered you out because someone with your background would be too observant. He said it as though it was an explanation. He paused. He almost succeeded in keeping you out of the building, which means the entire scheme, the leverage, the forgeries, Aldo Sette, all of it, was 4 days from continuing undisturbed for however long it needed to continue. She absorbed this quietly. 4 days, the distance between a clean filter and the whole thing unraveling. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you should know how close it was, he said. And because you should know that the thing that almost kept you out, the thing Ferretti saw as a liability, was the thing that ended it. He held her gaze steadily. You were too observant. He was right about that. He was wrong about what it meant. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Palermo was doing its evening thing, the city lights coming up against the darkening sky and the specific amber of a place that had been doing this for a very long time and intended to keep doing it. I want to show you something, Raphael said. He placed a document on the desk between them. She looked at it. It was a position description, a formal HR document, newly drafted, the ink still carrying the specific quality of something that had been written in the last 48 hours. The title at the top read, Executive Operations Advisor. She read through it. It was not a ceremonial title. The description was specific and operational, direct authority over contract review, financial oversight, vendor verification, risk assessment, a position with actual teeth, actual access, actual weight in the decision-making architecture of the company. A position, she understood as she read it, that had been designed around a specific person's specific capabilities rather than constructed from a generic template. This was created for you, he said, not as a reward, because the company needs this function performed, and you are the person who can perform it. He paused. If you want it. She looked at the document for a long moment. She thought about the temp agency in Memphis, the affordable suit that had been dry cleaned too many times, the bathroom stall where she'd read her own resume like it belonged to someone else, the specific quality of the loneliness of a person who knows what they're capable of and has no place to put it. She thought about her mother. You'll find somewhere that deserves you. She looked up at Raphael De Luca, who was watching her with the same quality of attention he'd had since the first day. The attention that went under the surface of things, that didn't evaluate by the easy metrics. She had spent 6 days being seen by this man in the specific way she had spent years not being seen by people who were supposed to see her, and she understood that this was not a small thing. She understood it and was appropriately careful about it, and did not confuse it for something it wasn't, because she was Cassia Monroe and she was careful about everything. Yes, she said. He nodded once. He took the document and signed it on his side and put it back on the desk in front of her, and she picked up a pen and signed it on hers, and the scratching of the pen on paper was the quietest possible sound for something that was, to her, quite large. He stood, collected his jacket from the back of the chair. One more thing, he said. She looked up. The blazer, he said. The one I told you to replace. On your first day. She looked at him. I was wrong to say that, he said. The words were flat and direct and carried none of the hedging that apologies usually arrived with. It had nothing to do with whether you could do the work. I said it because I was used to saying things like that and nobody told me not to. He paused. You didn't deserve it. She sat with that for a moment. It was not a dramatic apology. It was not a performance of remorse. It was a statement of fact from a man who had assessed something incorrectly and was correcting the record, which was, she thought, probably the most authentic version of an apology that a person like Raphael De Luca had access to. I know I didn't, she said. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. That same early architecture of something that needed more room than it was usually given. Tonight, briefly, it got a little more room. Good night, Ms. Monroe, he said. Good night, she said. He walked toward the elevator. She watched him go and then turned back to her desk and looked at the signed document in front of her and at the work still open on her screen and at the city outside the window going about its ancient business of being a city. And she felt something she recognized slowly and with some difficulty because it had been a long time since she'd felt it with this particular quality. Not relief, not triumph, not the fragile temporary lightness of having survived something. She felt like herself. Not the self she'd been trying to recover. Not the Cassia from the resume she'd read in a bathroom stall. The self that had walked into this building 6 days ago in an affordable blazer with 6 years of grief and gap behind her and a folder pressed to her ribs like a shield. That self, exactly as she was, with all the damage and all the capability and all the years of quiet and the years of brilliance and the loss and the returning and the particular exhaustion of a person who has spent a very long time being underestimated by people who should have known better. That self. Here, at this desk, in this city, at 7:20 in the evening with a signed document and a screen full of work and Palermo lit up outside the window like it had been waiting for her, specifically to arrive and stay. She turned back to the screen. She started working. Outside, the city kept going. The lights on the harbor moved and the streets filled and emptied and filled again. And somewhere 11 stories below, a woman in a too familiar blazer had once stood on a sidewalk counting floors and deciding whether she was brave enough to go inside. And the answer she'd arrived at had been yes, terrifyingly and improbably yes. And everything that had come from that yes was now exactly this: a desk, a document, a city, a self that had been lost for a long time, and had finally, in the most unlikely possible room, found its way back to solid ground. She didn't drop any pens that evening, but the next morning she dropped one, and she picked it up herself and didn't apologize, and nobody in the office thought anything of it, and that in the end was the quietest and most complete kind of victory there was.